Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes Mr. Fortenberry. You may proceed, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Chairman Bernanke, for your appearance here today. I read your testimony, and it appears to me to be a reasonable explanation of your role in the Bank of America Merrill Lynch merger and the advocacy of certain additional bailout funds. However, while that's the narrow purpose of this hearing, to unpack whether or not there were any conflicts there, and certainly you can understand the cynicism in that we've got conflicting impressions from you and Mr. Lewis about the nature of this deal. I think fundamentally what is at issue here, what is the heart of the matter, is the Fed's future role as a systemic regulator. And in that regard, let me go back to a couple of points that were just touched on. Do you believe it was in the best interest of this country for Merrill Lynch and Bank of America to be merged and to receive the bailout funds that they received? First the $25 billion between the two companies, and then later the $20 billion as Bank of America expressed concern, or let's put it another way, waffling about the potential deal.
I think it was critical that we avoided the failure of those firms and the implications that would have had for our financial system. We did so in a way that protected the taxpayer, and again, I think we did the right thing.
One thing that concerns me about this, though, is information that we have from the FDIC Chairman Sheila Bair, who wrote to you prior to the final bailout monies being received by Bank of America. She said, "Dear Ben, strong discomfort with this deal at the FDIC for all of the reasons you and I have discussed." What did you discuss?
My recollection is that her concern was not about taking action to stabilize Bank of America. Her concern was that the FDIC would have financial exposure as part of the transaction. And she was concerned in particular because the transaction involved not only a bank but also an investment bank, which was not in her sphere of responsibility. So it was that the details of the transaction, I understand it, that were her concern, not the basic idea of taking steps to stabilize the company.
Currently we have a situation, it's my understanding, where 10 major banks control about 50% of deposited assets in this country, Bank of America being the largest. Is this a systemic risk?
We have a lot large banks, and under our current system, and particularly in the current circumstances with financial conditions the way they are, the failure of one of those firms would be very dangerous for the American economy. And that's why I believe that the centerpiece of financial regulatory reform should be steps to get rid of too big to fail, to find measures that allow a large firm to fail when it's appropriate, but to do so in a way that doesn't bring everything else down with it.
Well, I agree with that assessment, but I think it's pointing to the need to, in whatever future regulatory framework that we have, to consider the fact that we have 10 banks controlling a majority of assets in this country, and that systemic risk is very real. Do you agree with that?
It's certainly real now, but I think there are steps that could reduce the risk associated with those banks.
What will be those steps, potentially?
Well, for example, greater oversight, capital, and supervision of those companies, a resolution regime that would...
that assumes failure.
In the case of failure, that's correct, but that would create more market discipline because lenders to those banks would know that they wouldn't necessarily be made whole in the case of a failure, and they would therefore exert more discipline on those companies.
The point I'm driving at, are these too big? These banks too big?
I think it's important that banks have no incentive to grow just to become too big to fail. But large banks probably have some other economic purposes, including global transactions networks and the like. I doubt we can go back to the world with only very small banks.
But we are concerned that this level of concentration in the hands of too few is a potential systemic
It's a legitimate
problem.
concern, Congressman, absolutely.
All right. I'd like to, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Burton from Indiana.
The gentleman has the remainder of the time, which is about a minute.
Well, thank you very much. You indicated that Secretary Paulson's comment that he made that threat at the request of Chairman Bernanke was changed later on by Mr. Paulson. But what he said was, and I think this ought to be in the record, his prediction of what could happen, talking about you, his prediction of what could happen to Lewis and the board was his language, was Paulson's language, but based on what he knew to be the Fed's strong opposition to Bank of America attempting to renounce the deal. You were the Fed. And he said it was based upon the knowledge that, that the Fed's strong opposition to Bank of America attempting to renounce the deal was something that he knew to be the case, and that he was, in effect, speaking on behalf of what you had said to him.
The gentleman's time's expired. Chairman Bernanke, you're directed to answer his question now. Thank you.
We were strongly opposed to that action for the reasons I've described.
Is that your answer?
Yes.
Okay. I thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes Mr. Welch. Thank you.